Hello, it is, what day is it? It is September 30th,
Thursday, I
2021.
think, I'm told.
So September 30th, 2021, and here today with Ed Yong, and who has been, well, I'm going to let him tell you all the things that he's been doing throughout the course of the pandemic and a bit about his life and his career. But as a journalist, as a kind of explainer, and as somebody who has through his articles, I think, driven a lot of the conversation in the United States and around the world. So delighted to have Ed with us today. And I will turn it over to you to, what have you been doing during the pandemic?
What have I been doing? Okay, I am a science writer. I've been writing about science and nature and health since 2006, and since 2015 I've been doing that exclusively at The Atlantic, where I am a staff writer, part of a small team that covers those areas. I first started writing about pandemics, I think, quite soon after I joined. I wrote about panic neglect cycles in 2015. I wrote about how a pandemic might play out under Trump in 2016. I wrote a big feature for The Atlantic in 2018 about whether America was prepared or not for the next pandemic. So this has been on my mind for a while. Strangely, when the pandemic actually began in the very end of 2019, I was on book leave. I was trying to think about something else completely and tried hard to stay that way for several months until March of last year, when it became clear that this was going to be one of the biggest, not that book, in fact, the follow-up to that book, yeah, so in March 2020, when it became clear that the COVID pandemic was going to be one of the biggest stories of our time, one of the biggest crises of our time, I went back to work at The Atlantic to start covering it. And since then, I've written, I guess, over 30 stories, most of which have been very long. They've ranged from about 2,000 to 8,000 words, about different aspects of the pandemic, how COVID-19 pummeled America so badly, how it continued to do so, how we remain stuck in the same cycle of mistakes that we've made for much of the last 1.5 years. Right from the start, when I came back to book leave and started trying to cover the pandemic, my goal was to try and do big, sweeping, broad pieces that would help anchor our readers in this very, very confusing and very tumultuous moment. I've used this metaphor to death now, but I've thought of the pandemic as this, as like a raging torrent of both information and misinformation. We all felt last year and even this year, like, how confusing it is, how difficult it is to keep up with rapidly changing developments, rapidly changing results from scientific papers. It all just seemed like a massive mess. And what I wanted to do in my work was to try and make sense of that for the Atlantic's readers, to provide a solid platform in the middle of that raging torrent so that people could stand on something stable and watch what was happening around them without themselves getting swept away in it. Most of the work I've tried to do, certainly last year, involved trying to not second guess, but sort of, yeah, I guess second guess what were the questions that people were asking and try to answer them even before they realized they were asking them. So how will the pandemic end? What's in store for our summer? Why are we stuck in the same place? Why is this all so confusing? How did it come to this? Those pieces have also, one thing I tried to do from the very start was to recognize that the pandemic is an omni-crisis. It affects every sector of our society, and it can't just be viewed as a science and health story. Obviously, those elements are crucial to it. To understand the pandemic, you absolutely do need to understand virology and immunology and epidemiology. But I think to really understand it, you need to draw from the social sciences as well. You need to understand the pandemic as a societal event. You need to understand how it's born from our ways of thinking, the metaphors we use, the ways in which the society that we built in lots of respects was susceptible to the spread of a new pathogen. So in all of those pieces, I've tried to speak to not only basic research scientists, clinicians, but also public health voices, sociologists, anthropologists, linguists, historians. I've tried to speak to people with expertise across all of the areas of society that are pertinent to the pandemic, and really all of them are pertinent. And I think and I hope that that approach has been useful to our readers. I think that it's given people a solid footing from which to observe like this chaos around us. I said that last year the work was largely about trying to answer the questions people are asking. I feel like this year the work is more often about trying to answer the questions that people have forgotten to ask. So a lot of the pieces I've written in 2021 have been about things like the lingering trauma from the pandemic that is often forgotten and neglected. The most recent piece I did was about these cycles of panic and neglect that almost everyone in public health who I've spoken to has talked about, and whether even in the moment when we're still trying to deal with this pandemic, whether we are making mistakes that will doom us to repeating that cycle in the future. So that piece not only talks about disinvestment in public health, but also tries to ask like why those disinvestments have been so consistent and periodic over the last century. Like, and you know, it looks at how America mishandled the arrival of Delta, but also goes back like to the mid-19th century to think about like how the rise of germ theory as a concept led to our bias towards biomedicine over social solutions, and just the way we frame and think about pandemics as a problem for individuals fighting pathogens rather than the problem that emerges from the vulnerabilities of our society. So it's that kind of broad picture that I try to bring to the pieces. I like to think of it as like taking like a question or a problem and thinking laterally. So how does this play out across all the different sectors of society that I've talked about, but also thinking, stretching back temporally. So going back in time to look at how our history led us up to here, and thinking ahead to the future of what pitfalls might we encounter further down the line.
Can I ask, do you get requests? I mean, do people come to you and say, would you please write about this, or don't write about that?
That's a really good question. You know, I do get requests. I would say that in the normal cadence of my job, requests and like story tips are usually more useful than they have been during the pandemic. I think during the pandemic, I found that most of the requests and suggestions I've had have been pretty granular, right? So they've been like, can you write a story about this specific thing that no one has written about yet? And usually it's quite a small topic. They are often like very interesting and the types of stories that I would have written like 2 or 3 years ago. But I am trying to think like in a more big picture-y way now. And what I've instead found is that quite often what has happened is I've reached out to a bunch of people for interviews for a new piece that I've worked on. And those same people have replied with, it's really weird that you've just reached out for this, because this is exactly what like my colleagues and I have been talking about for the last like week, right? So that's been part of that's been the goal. Like when I said I was trying to second guess the questions that people didn't even know they were asking, but that's sort of it. Like I want to be writing pieces that people who are immersed in this field like no need to be written, but that haven't been written yet. like the piece that I just wrote about whether we're already lapsing into the panic neglect cycle now. When Greg Gonzalez at Yale was the first person I spoke to for that, and he said at the end of it that like he thought that this was the most important piece about the pandemic that hadn't yet been written about the pandemic. And that's what I want to do. That's what I've tried to do for the last year and a half, is to find those pieces and write them, at the point when like they're still like just bubbling in the middle of people's conversations.
And I think that, well, I mean, clearly they have been well received. I should have mentioned at the start that not only has I've been writing throughout the pandemic, but he has also been acknowledged for his writing and a recent recipient of the Pulitzer. So, we got to throw that in there, make sure everybody knows.
I still can't say the P word, really. So I'm glad.
We'll say it for you, right?
Thank you.
I have a bunch of questions, but I really, maybe you can comment a little bit on the maybe the state of communication in general in public health. Mm-hmm. I think that you've played such a critical role, in part because there hasn't been a lot of other folks who have been explaining things very well or connecting quite well with the public. So I'm curious about what you think about the state of the field of public health communication and crisis and risk communication. But then also, what comes next? Like where do you think we go in the next few months?
Yeah, let's take that first. Let's do the communications piece first. I do think that like there certainly from a journalistic perspective, yes, there has been a lot of bad work that's emerged from the pandemic, but I think like a lot of good stuff too. In terms of public health specifically and the challenges that it's faced, there's been a team from Kaiser Health News and the AP, including Lauren Weber, Anna Berry Jester, and others whose names I will forget, who are part of that same group, who have been doing a really good job of tracking like the pressures that public health has faced over the course of this. I'm just trying to make sure that I get her name correct. But yeah, Selena Simmons Duffin at NPR has also been doing that. So there's been some good work. I do think that it is challenging because of some of the issues that we've talked about. I think the pressures on journalism at the moment are very intense, and they skew toward, and all the incentives push people towards quick, short content that can be pushed out very quickly, and allow people to then move on to the next thing. It's a model that's based more on quantity over quality. I am very privileged to work in a place like the Atlantic, which allows me to do the opposite. The fact that I tried to do these big sweeping pieces from the off was entirely due to the fact that I was given a mandate to do that and the time and space to do that. So that it was explicitly made clear to me in March of last year, your talents are best served doing these big hits rather than like doing a daily, like what is happening piece. Core to that is our belief that the Atlantic should be not just about telling people what is happening, but telling them what that means, like helping them to make sense of what is happening, which is a very different skill set that I think a lot of journalism misses because it is never given the environment in which it can actually even think about that. Like if you're doing short pieces, how can you look to the past? Like how can you spend the time reading like, the B. and Brown historical review, like classic works in public health that really ground our modern understanding. Like most reporters absolutely do not have the time to do that kind of background reading. I do, and I'm grateful for it. But I think we need to sort of if we want, like, so much of my work has been about how our failures are as much, if not much more systemic than individual. And I think the same applies to journalism, into academia. It affects like how the communications that scientists and public health experts have been faced with, are the challenges they've been faced with over the course of the pandemic. Again, I think what I've said about journalism is sort of mirrored within the field of public health. Some people have done a tremendous job at communication. Some people have been terrible. I think we have an ecosystem in the media and vetted by social media that rewards people for the wrong kinds of things, and rewards people for quantity, for um, for being snarky and quick, rather than being careful and measured, and for doing the hard work of synthesizing, for telling, we sort of reward people for adding heat, not light. And I think that's led to some of the problems that we've seen. One of the criticisms I received from a piece that I wrote quite early on in the pandemic in summer of 2020 was that I was writing about public health, but only really interviewing like people who were like deans of schools of public health in like wealthy, like New England universities. And I took that to heart. I don't think I've like managed to fully rectify that, but I've tried to talk to a broad swath of people who work in the area from across the country, and when I can, to try and talk to folks who work at like local public health departments, and I think that that's actually really important, because the perspectives you get are very different. I think a lot of those folks are really, really, really on the front lines, and experience much different pressures and have much different perspectives than folks who are, the types of people who are more frequently in the media, who are getting like op-ed chances and like appearing on nightly news all the time. So
Can I ask though, how do you develop that? And I'll use a phrase that tells you how old I am. How do you develop that Rolodex?
like quite gradually. I've made a very specific effort to try. So every piece I write, I try and make sure that roughly half of the people I speak to are people I've spoken to for the first time. So there are folks who I come back to again and again, but I don't think there's anyone who I've talked to more than, say, like, I don't know, 5 times over the course of the pandemic. And I've written a lot of pieces. So I'm constantly trying to find new people to talk to, new voices to hear from. Some of that, some of that is fairly organic. Like Twitter can be a way of like calcifying your echo chamber if you just like listen to the same people again and again, but it can actually be a good way of diversifying too. If you look at the sort of periphery of the discussions, if you look at what like people who aren't like pandemic famous now, who they're talking to and who they're listening to, you can often find a lot of folks and who should be on that Rolodex. So yeah, it's been a slow process of trying to branch out. I came into this in March of 2020, knowing that I had written about pandemics before, but also knowing that I didn't want to just like call all the same people who I talked to in when I did my piece in 2018. So I'm always trying to like find new folks. And yeah, that's just a kind of a slow, gradual process.
So can I ask, I don't know if I'm breaking like a journalism rule by asking this, but can you tell us what you're working on? I know you just put out the latest piece, but I assume you're already, mapping out the next 4 things you're working on as well.
This is actually a very singular time to be asking me this question, because I actually don't know. For once, I don't know. I had a list of things that I wanted to write about um, that was quite long. That was quite long, quite clear as of like June. Like with this, with what we, so I mentioned that I thought this year was going to be about writing the stories that people weren't thinking about. And you know, when after uh, cases and everything seemed to be much more optimistic at the end of spring, I was trying to work out like what those things were. So you know, I knew I wanted to write a piece about this tension between individualism and collectivism in the pandemic response, and I managed to do that. And then I had a bunch of ideas that were sort of put on the back burner because Delta smacked us, and you know, I was writing again about hospitals being overwhelmed. You know, I read a big piece about how the pandemic now ends. And then after that, I got a chance to step back and do some of the ones that I've been wanting to write for a long while. So, you know, the piece I wrote before this about long haulers and that tension between the biomedical establishment paying more attention to this condition, but patients still feeling like their needs weren't being met. That is a piece that I've been wanting to do since like almost the start of this year. Like I had it in my mind like while I wasn't still on book leave, and it just kept on being pushed to the side by other things. And similarly, this idea of like, are we still trapped in the panic and neglect? Are we barreling into the neglect phase, even though the pandemic is still with us? Like, I wanted to write that piece in May, and in some ways, I think it makes it stronger that it's coming out now, because I think the thesis is stronger. I think there's more evidence that it's correct, but it's a little sad that like you know, these big pieces take a lot of time and they take a lot of energy, and they part of the process of part of this work involves trying to balance the needs of the moment versus the needs of the future. I'm not sure I've explained that well, but like so if you look at the pieces I've done this year, a lot of them are like, so like the piece on pandemic trauma is really about saying, okay, we're into like a quiet phase, but let's not forget like the consequences of everything we've experienced. The one about the recent one about the panic neglect cycle is about saying, okay, things look bad right now, but I also need you to think like 10 steps ahead. You know, I need us to like, I need you as a country to like chew and to walk and chew gum at the same time, or we're going to be doing this again. And those two types of things, like the retrospective pieces and the forward-looking ones, are really hard to pull off in a moment where like everything is on fire, because you know, my editors and my readers and like me, I also want to figure out what is going on and what it means and all of those big questions. I think part of the reason I've been able to take a step back and do the other kinds of pieces that I think are important is that I'm part of a team. So, you know, I have colleagues like Katie Wu and Rachel Gutman and Sarah Zhang, who are phenomenal and who have just taken on the very difficult burden of like, you know, writing pieces about boosters and school reopenings and vaccine mandates and you know, all of the really pressing, like of the moment things that our readers want to know about, which gives me again a bit more space to think about these sort of big picture questions.
Well, I think we are all thankful that you have this space that you ask and answer some of the questions that maybe we don't even know to ask yet. So for that, we are extraordinarily thankful for everything that you've done to date and for everything that you're going to continue to do in the pandemic, and feeling very fortunate.